Thank you for being patient as we laid the preliminaries for the discussion of personal judgment now, what happens at judgment, with the so-called language of the toll houses that I know many of you have been vexed by, the idea of angels and demons that I know many of you have been questioning at the moment of death, the idea of what happens to the soul in its journey after death. All of this preliminary stuff is essential for two reasons. First of all, if you focus on the imagery of the discussion of the experience of the soul after death without this background, you can easily fall into a literalism without being able to contextualize it in a broader understanding of the human person and of salvation. That is something that must be avoided at all costs. The second reason that this context is necessary is that you really don't understand the importance of these other aspects of salvation unless you understand the centrality of death in them. All right? It all fits together. What I was going to talk about next is something I've mentioned yesterday and mentioned, I think, at the beginning of the talk today, but didn't really explain. And that's the idea of Gnosticism. When we discuss the toll houses and other aspects of the journey of the soul after death, the issue of Gnosticism is bound to come up. What is Gnosticism? Gnosticism is very hard to define because it's not a religious system with a set of established tenets and principles like, say, Catholicism or Orthodoxy or Methodism or Presbyterianism or whatever. In other words, Gnosticism was not an organized church that you went and signed up to. It was a movement with various common elements that joined various expressions of the Gnostic worldview. The basic idea of the Gnostic worldview was that matter was evil and that spirit was good. That's the fundamental characteristic of Gnostic expressions everywhere. So according to Gnosticism, at the bottom level of all creation was the material world. The material world was evil. It was at the bottom of the heap. It was something to be avoided at all costs. It was the source of filth, pollution. It was the cause of great suspicion. The creator of the material world, borrowing a term from Greek philosophy, it's called the demiurge. It's the demiurge that created the material world. And this God was the evil God, the God who dared to introduce such filth and such corruption into the universe. Gnostics equated the demiurge with the God of the Jews and the Christians. Christians proclaim, what do we say? The first line of the creed. I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth and of all things visible, earth and visible. That's what that the idea of creating things seen, things visible. The material world said, aha, this God of the Christians is the demiurge. So Gnosticism pitted itself against Christianity in a very sort of frontal way. And yet, some scholars wonder whether Gnosticism even existed before Christianity did. Gnosticism, in many ways, may be a deviant form of Christianity, but it certainly was against the orthodox definition of Christianity. The true God was, of course, not the demiurge, but the one. Perfect. Had nothing to do with the making of the created world, and was so full of perfection, so full of divinity, so full of every kind of energy that there were emanations from the one. The one was not self-contained, but rather sort of spilled out of itself. And these emanations created a realm known as the pleroma, which in Greek means the fullness. The fullness. In many Gnostic texts, this is called the realm of light. The realm of light. Now, here was the problem, according to Gnostics. A very Greek Platonic view of things, human beings had within them a spark. That spark was imprisoned in the body. Death, according to the Gnostics, was therefore a good thing because it sprung the soul from the body. And in springing the soul from the body, the soul was freed from its entrapments and its enmeshments in the material world, and then was free to ascend to the realm of light, to the pleroma. All right? Once the soul had been separated from the body, it could make an ascent to the truly and purely spiritual realm. Now here's where it gets interesting for our purposes. The Gnostics believed that between the material world and the pleroma, the fullness, the realm of light, there were regions in the air which are usually called in Gnostic texts the spheres. The spheres. And a soul that had been sprung from the body at death and tried to rise to the pleroma, the realm of light, had to make it through the spheres, which were populated by hostile aerial spirits. And in order to get by those spirits, one had to have a special knowledge. The special knowledge which they had to have was in Greek called gnosis, hence the name of this religious movement, Gnosticism. Now, you see the points here. How this is in absolute contradiction to genuine Christianity. And the New Testament is filled with this kind of, just below the surface, loathing of Gnosticism. If one reads, I have a little exercise for you. I won't collect it, so you can do it only if you want to. Read the Epistle to the Colossians. In the Epistle to the Colossians, St. Paul fulminates against the Gnostics, and I want you to count how many times the word fullness, filled, full, fill are used in that epistle. For instance, he says of Christ, in him the fullness of the Godhead dwelt in bodily form. In other words, what he's saying here, all this fullness language of the Gnostics, I'm going to turn on its own head and use it to say the truth of Christianity in opposition. And notice what they say. In him, all the fullness of God was made to dwell in bodily form. Okay? So the idea that the Gnostics were just some esoteric sect on the margins and didn't have much to do with Christianity is really wrong. Gnosticism was the archenemy of Christianity, and it assailed Christianity on its major points. First of all, number one, that the God of the Christians created the material world. And what does the Hebrew Bible says? When God sees it, what does he say about every aspect of creation? He saw it, and it is good. Gnostics said, exact opposite. What did Christians teach? That the Son of God became, incarnate. Why would any real God take on the material world, become part of this corrupt, fleshly, physical world? And then, to take the cake. What did Christians teach? After Jesus died, shedding that body, he rose again. Why would anyone want to resurrect a body once you were freed from it? So Christianity and Gnosticism were in direct opposition one to the other. But I have to tell you, Gnosticism flourished in Christian circles, in some circles that called themselves Christian. And there was always this tendency in some Christian circles, not Orthodox, of course, that had a heretical bent, to adopt this Gnostic view where the physical world was repudiated and only the spiritual world was affirmed. Gnosticism wanted people to shake off the physical world, and it had two ways that it encouraged its followers to free itself from the confines of the material world. My students always like this. The first way that you could free yourself from the confines of the body, from enchacklement in the material world, was to be a libertine. You know, some clinics, if we want to stop smoking, they'll bring you into a room, sit you down at the room, and put a big bowl of cigarettes in front of you, and they'll say, start smoking, and don't stop until I tell you to. And after a while, you get so sick to your stomach, you never want to see another cigarette. The idea is if one sated the passions, one would be able to shed the demands of the passion on the body. You know, so if eating was something that really had you captive within its grasp, you sit down and you eat until you get sick. If sex had its control over you, you lived the libertine life to the fullest. Many of my students are ready to sign up at this point. So that was one way that the Gnostics wanted to free the spirit from the confines of the body. All right? For them, salvation was the exact opposite of what I've been discussing today. It was not the salvation of the whole person, body and soul together. It was the salvation of the spirit through a special knowledge that enabled that soul, that spirit, to leave the physical world, completely detach itself from it, and assume fullness of spiritual existence in the pledoma, in the realm of light. So the body was denigrated as the object of salvation. All right? And true Christianity was therefore seen as saving the soul, and salvation was not seen as aimed toward the body. The image of God was just the soul, not the body. Of course, the other way that one could free oneself from enchacklement to the body was rigorism, a kind of asceticism that was so harsh, so severe. So, if food was the thing that enmeshed you in the world of passions, you fasted so severely you ate almost nothing. To enjoy any pleasure in life was considered wrong. If sleep was something that assailed you, you never slept. In other words, you pushed the body to the limits of denial. And in pushing the body to the limits of denial, the body's control over the soul would be loosened. Now, you can hear ideas in this, can't you, that have made their way into Christianity. If you read carefully the texts of Orthodox Christianity with a small o and also with a capital O, you will find that the fathers of the church, for instance, are clear to have people steer clear of an asceticism that is destructive of the body. All right? And of course, libertinism would be considered something completely out of the question. But the idea was that Christianity made an attempt to show that the created order was not beyond the pale of divine activity, but was very much a focus of God's attention. There was always a reaction to this in Christianity, where people wanted to say what really matters is only the spiritual and not the physical or material, and that what really matters is freeing the soul from the body, and what really matters is separating ourselves from this dirty world in which we live. Right? Now, we still have these problems with us today. Orthodox Christianity teaches that asceticism is part and parcel, the core of Orthodox Christian life, really. But Orthodox asceticism, properly understood, is an asceticism that disciplines the body and disciplines the soul so that the body and soul become perfectly integrated, so that the image of God in the person is restored as closely as one can get to the stage in which human beings were before the fall. All right, for instance, what do we do in Lent? Why don't we eat meat during Lent? Not just to make us suffer, that's a very sick kind of attitude, but we're trying to recover the state of paradise. By the way, read Genesis, the opening chapters of Genesis. It says quite clearly, God gave the seed-bearing plants for human beings and the animals to eat. They weren't allowed to eat meat till after the flood. All right? The idea was no violence was done to these animals, these higher beings. The idea then was asceticism in the Orthodox context was not to say the body is evil, the body is wicked, the body is dirty, the body must be repudiated. All pleasure is something that is completely beyond the pale of God's grace. Rather, it was to say impulses get out of control, the passions assail us and disorient us, and disintegrate us. The purposes of asceticism are to bring about that integration that was lost. So that what? The image of God. The human being as an integrated person, as a moral agent, is restored. Gnosticism sort of stood against that. And Christianity still to this day, in many ways, has to confront both of these Gnostic tendencies. Does it not? On the one hand, you have people, when I was in graduate school, there was a guy across the hall from me. Let me tell you, he would constantly ask me, all the time, he says, "Are you saved?" And I would, the first couple times I was very patient in trying to explain, and he kept asking me that. And he would always end the conversation with, "Well, whatever, I know I'm saved." So I told him once, why don't we just start with that principle and leave me alone, all right? But the fact was, he led a thoroughly libertine life. I mean, believe me, he did. And I found out that his attitude was, the physical world was so corrupt and dirty that, yes, he was involved with it, but grace made up for everything that he did. There was no exercise of the will on his part, no discipline of the will to do good because he knew he was saved. It didn't matter what he did. All right? This kind of libertinism to him was the highest form of Christianity. Any attempt to really live a disciplined life, to fast, for instance, he would say, works righteousness. I'd say, well, what kind of righteousness do you have? This kind of idea then, that libertine behavior sort of freed you in a way from being too worried about the demands of the world, is something that's very much present. The other side is also present. And we in Orthodoxy, as well as in some other faiths that tend toward a more traditional trajectory of Christian life, isn't it true that we always have to fight against rigorism, where there's an attitude that I am stricter, I am doing more prostrations than you, I'm fasting more rigorously than you. This is what true orthodoxy is. Anything less than this is a corruption and a compromise, you dirty modernist, you. I've been on that side of it many, many, many times. All right? So this kind of view of the world has certain parallel elements with Christianity, which very dangerously disguise themselves as Christianity. I guarantee you, some of you here are better educated theologically than the regular Joe in the street. But I was at a family gathering once, okay? And I saw an old professor friend of mine there. And she's a great friend. I mean, she really has a good heart and is a spiritual seeker, all right? And she says, "I just have to talk to you." She says, "Do you have any time?" So I said, "Sure, I have some time." So we went outside and we sat down. She goes, "I just want you to know I had the weirdest experience this weekend at a church, and I just want you to tell me whether this place is a cult, because if it is, I'll never go back to it." I said, "Fine, that's fair enough. Tell me about it." And she said, the preacher, the minister, was saying that our bodies are going to rise again on the last day, that there'll be a resurrection. She says, "What kind of weirdness?" She had been raised in a mainstream Protestant church, and I said, "Stephanie, this is Christianity." She goes, "I never heard that. When you die, your body, you're done with it, and your soul's with God. End of story. What's all this resurrection talk?" And I said, "No, I mean, we believe in the resurrection of the dead." And then I really floored her. I was saying, we'll spend eternity in a resurrected and perfected body. She says, "This is just too weird to hear about." So you see, her understanding of Christianity had been thoroughly Gnosticized. Death was a good thing. It sprang the soul from the body. The soul went to be with God. I remember at Harvard Divinity School, I couldn't find things about funeral practices. I was doing a cross-cultural comparison of funeral practices, and I went to the librarian and I said, "I can't find something about this topic." And she told me, "Look under body, disposal of." I said, "What does that indicate about how people saw the body?" This is a Gnosticized understanding of Christianity. Now, it is very important, and that's why I stressed it up to this point, to understand human beings as a psychophysical unity and to also understand this image of God as somehow residing in the human being as body and soul perfectly integrated. You cannot understand the orthodox understanding of death or of salvation or of anthropology unless that point is just driven home. And if you remember nothing else, remember that. All right? Gnosticism has never faded away. We congratulate ourselves that Gnosticism has been conquered. It has not been. And yet there have been Gnostic texts, we read them, where Christ's suffering on the cross was merely an illusion. There's even been that tendency among us sometimes where we're so ill at ease talking about how Christ really suffered, on the cross. Somehow we think he was God. The suffering was only an appearance. That is not, of course, Orthodox teaching, but many people really think that. As God, he really didn't suffer. We have to be very careful about Gnosticism infecting our way of thinking about Christian truths. Okay? Now, having said that, let me get to the next order of business. Gnosticism was not clearly labeled as those people out there who are opposed to true Christianity and should be avoided at all costs. Many Christians, people who called themselves Christians, were Gnostics at heart. They were Gnostics in thought. They were Gnostic in worldview. And even those who weren't breathed an air of a culture where Gnostic ideas were constantly afoot. And what happened is that Gnostic symbols, Gnostic models, were imported into Christianity. Okay? Gnostic language was imported into Christianity. Now, I'm not saying that is evil in itself. Here's the point I want to make. There are definitely elements of Gnostic language and symbolism, figures, images, and so forth in Orthodox liturgical texts, in Orthodox patristic texts. But here's the point. These texts, which use these Gnostic images, Christianize them, just like a lot of other Greek philosophical concepts and other vocabularies from the pagan world were taken in by Christianity and adopted and Christianized to explain Christian truths. Okay? Now, what Christianity did with this Gnostic imagery, Gnostic vocabulary, and the view of certain processes after death is they reinterpreted them. It is wrong to take them at their literal face value and assume that that is what Christianity is using them for. All right? So when you're reading about things, and I could see many of you when I was discussing this Gnostic worldview shaking your hands as if you had already heard it before and had heard of this in a lot of the books you had read. If you interpret these things in a literal way, simplistically, crudely, crassly, and without sophistication, without the backdrop of what? Solid Orthodox anthropology and solid Orthodox soteriology, you're going to fall into a Gnostic trap. And you're going to become very afraid. Because the Gnostics did not have a sense of God entering into death and shattering it from within, of sanctifying the material order by actually becoming incarnated into it. In other words, the way we understand salvation, the way we understand anthropology, has to guide the way we look at this language. Okay? I didn't rant too much about that, did I? I sort of stayed calm. But that's the point that we have to make. There is a rigorism afoot in many Orthodox circles that is very dangerous. And here's the way the thinking goes. The more literal my interpretation, the more extreme my expression of a pious practice, the more underscored my position, the more overstated my stance, the more pious I am, and the more orthodox I should be evaluated as being. That is not what orthodoxy is about. Orthodoxy is about integration of creation and God, body and soul, this world and the world to come. The Orthodox worldview is a worldview of integration, not of extremism. And do not let yourself be intimidated by people who clothe themselves in hyper-Orthodox clothes and are really trying to purvey a form of Gnosticism with is really sort of a clothing of an extremism that has nothing to do with traditional Orthodoxy. Yaroslav Pelikan said it the best. He said, tradition is the living religion of the dead. Traditionalism is the dead religion of the living. And this kind of attitude always has to be kept in mind. Now, I bring this up because we get into this debate, this hot debate, about whether language that is used about the soul's journey after death, namely the toll houses and demons and angels and all that stuff, is a valid Orthodox way of looking at death and afterlife. I want to tell you my position from the outset. You cannot deny that this language is used in the texts of the church, the liturgical texts of the church. It is used in the writings of the fathers, going back to the 3rd and 4th centuries in many ways. So what we have to do is not throw out the baby with the bathwater. But what we have to do is say, all right, the language is there, but that doesn't mean the way it's interpreted is as a simplistic, crassly, crudely literal way. All right? I'll probably be crucified for having said this, but let me say it anyway. You can crucify me afterwards. A lot of language that we use in discussing death is, quote unquote, mythological language. Now, that doesn't mean it's not true. What it means is this: when human beings are describing realities that are beyond the range of their day-to-day experiences, they must use language that is elevated language, supernatural language, mythological language. But it is not to be meant to be taken literally in all cases. All right? So, having said that, let me start, before I close, before we open up for questions, and just start the beginning of this process, which will continue tomorrow. Now, you're probably wondering, why did you spend so much time in anthropology and soteriology? Every step of the way, I'm going to point out why. And if there's ever a tendency to fall off the precipice into Gnosticism, I'm going to yank you right back up again. Okay? All right. Judgment is the issue that we're going to discuss next. The topic that we're going to turn to is when the books are opened. Judgment. There's an image for you. All right? I would like to think that if there were actually records that are opened up, God would have a really high-powered computer at this point and not books. When the books are open, judgment. Okay? Judgment is probably the most problematic issue that is addressed when we look at the Orthodox teaching of life after death because of all of the imagery that's used in it. The choice that sits before each one of us is to take those images literally, or, which is the easy way out, or understanding the truths, the ineffable truths, the mysterious truths, the mystical truths that these images reveal. At the moment of death, judgment begins. Okay? Why judgment ensues with the separation of the soul from the body is because, remember the story I told you yesterday about this nun friend of mine who goes on retreat, all right, out in isolation. When external stimuli are removed, the soul turns in on itself and judges itself, okay? Why do you think monks went out into the desert, by the way? There are many places they could have gathered to meditate, but you go to the desert because, to use the language of psychology, in the desert you're in an area of, I think they call it sensory deprivation, okay? In other words, I remember the first time I was in a desert, by the way, it scared the wits out of me. Because I remember this was in Judea, in Judah, southern Judah. I was out in the desert, and there was no one around me. I was out quite a distance from the bus that I was going to take back out of the desert, I hoped. And I remember thinking the silence was unbearable. The silence was loud, if I can put it that way. You could almost feel the silence press in on the ears. And it wasn't just because I was near the Dead Sea and we were so far below sea level. There was a sense of silence pressing in on me. You can see how ascetics in the desert had no opportunity for doing anything other than reflect and assess. This is why monasticism, in a way, was seen as a preparation for the judgment of the soul at death. And not something that monks feared, just something they were preparing for. Okay? Now, I'm going to end up today by bringing up the first of these controversial images that we talk about at the moment of death. St. John Maximovich says this. St. John Maximovich of San Francisco, Shanghai and San Francisco, he said in one of his homilies, Life After Death, he says, "But when the soul leaves the body, the soul finds itself among other spirits, good and bad. Usually, it inclines towards those who are more akin to it in spirit. And if while in the body, the soul was under the influence of certain ones, it will remain in dependence upon them when it leaves the body, however unpleasant they may turn out to be upon encountering them."
This is the end of Side 1. Please turn this cassette over for the continuation of the message on Side 2.